Hello, and welcome to my channel. What was happening on that medieval night while a blizzard raged outside? Are we ready to listen? Please subscribe to hear both historical events and the stories hidden within history, and let me know what time and where you're watching from. A night in the Middle Ages while a blizzard raged outside the door. The wind hit the shutters of Godwin's cottage just after dark, hard enough to rattle the wooden bar holding them shut. And his wife, Edith, looked up sharply from the pot she was stirring over the hearth fire. It was the third night of a storm that had already buried the path to the village well under drifts taller than a man, and Godwin, a tenant farmer working land not far from a small Yorkshire manor in the early 14th century, had spent the afternoon doing what every experienced household head in this period knew to do when a storm turned genuinely dangerous: checking the animals, banking the fire, and counting with a private, growing unease exactly how much firewood remained stacked against the far wall. Their two children, a boy of 9 named Dwight and a girl of 6 named Alice, sat close to the fire wrapped in the same rough wool blankets the family had used every winter of their short lives, while the household's single cow shifted quietly in the attached lean-to that shared a wall with the main room, its body heat a genuine and deliberate part of how this small, single-room dwelling stayed warm enough to survive nights like this one. This was not an unusual arrangement for a family of Godwin's modest means in medieval rural England. Keeping livestock under the same roof, or in a directly attached structure, represented a practical, widely used strategy for managing exactly the kind of brutal, sustained cold now pressing against the cottage's thin wattle and dog walls from every side. It was who heard it first over the wind, a sound that was not the storm, not the cow, not the settling of the thatch overhead, but something closer to a fist striking wood somewhere near the door. Godwin froze where he stood by the hearth. A knock at the door during an ordinary evening was one thing. A knock during the third night of the worst storm the region had seen in years was something else entirely. And every instinct shaped by a lifetime in this harsh, unpredictable landscape told him that whoever or whatever waited on the other side of that door had either survived something remarkable to reach it, or represented a danger he could not yet name. Medieval households facing exactly this moment operated within a framework of genuine, deeply held obligation that shaped Godwin's next actions as much as his own caution did. Hospitality toward travelers, and particularly toward anyone caught outside during dangerous weather, carried real moral and religious weight throughout medieval Christian Europe. Understood not simple canis, but as an obligation rooted in scripture and reinforced constantly through sermons, parish teaching, and the lived example of religious institutions that took in storm-bound strangers as a matter of course. To turn away a traveler genuinely in danger from the storm was, in the moral framework Godwin had been raised within since childhood, a genuine sin, one that weighed against him even as his more immediate, practical fear urged caution against the unknown, standing at his door in the middle of a night when no honest business should have brought anyone this far from shelter. Edith, moving to pull the children back from the door, without a word needing to pass between her and Godwin, understood the same tension he did. She had heard the stories, as had every person in this small rural community, of travelers found frozen along the moorland tracks. After storms exactly like this one, their deaths recorded in the terse, administrative language of manorial court rolls that noted such losses with a regularity that made clear just how genuinely common they were across the medieval countryside. She had also heard other stories, the kind told more quietly and less officially, of what else the deep winter nights sometimes seemed to bring to isolated doors, stories that blended a very real, practical fear of wolves and desperate men with bitter, half-remembered beliefs about the winter season itself, beliefs the church had spent centuries working to reshape and reinterpret within a Christian framework, without ever fully erasing the older unease that still lived quietly in how people spoke of nights exactly like this one. Godwin lifted the wooden bar from the door with hands that, he would later admit to no one but himself, were not entirely steady, and pulled it open against a wind that seemed determined to tear it from his grip entirely. What stood in the doorway was, at first, difficult to make out clearly against the churning white behind it, a figure, hunched and unmoving, snow built up thickly across shoulders that Godwin could not immediately tell belonged to a man or a woman, tall or short, young or old. For a long moment that felt, to everyone inside the cottage, considerably longer than it likely was, the figure said nothing at all, and did not move. Then the figure swayed, caught itself against the doorframe with one gloved hand, and spoke in a voice hoarse from cold, evidently from considerable shouting into the wind that had swallowed every previous attempt to be heard. It was a man's voice, young, and carrying an accent that marked him immediately as no local villager, but a stranger to this particular stretch of moorland entirely, his words coming slowly and with visible difficulty through lips that had clearly spent far too long exposed to the storm's full force. He asked, simply, for shelter, and named no further business, offered no explanation for why a man traveled alone across dangerous open country during the worst storm in years, a silence that Godwin noticed immediately and filed away, even as his hand moved instinctively to help steady the stranger's obvious, dangerous unsteadiness. Godwin pulled him inside without further hesitation. The moral weight of the obligation already settled in his mind, before any full accounting of the stranger's story could be made. And together with Edith, he guided the man toward the fire, noting as the light finally struck his properly, that his skin carried the pale, waxy look of someone who had been exposed to severe cold for a genuinely dangerous length of time. His hands, when Edith carefully worked his frozen gloves free, showing fingers gone an alarming white that she recognized immediately from a lifetime spent in This harsh landscape, as the early, still treatable stage of frostbite, rather than the blackened, permanent damage that came when such injuries were left too long. She began at once the practical, well-understood work of gentle rewarming, wrapping his hands in cloth warmed near, but not directly against, the fire, since even in a household without formal medical training, generations of hard experience with exactly this kind of injury had taught her genuine danger of warming frozen flesh too quickly or too close to open flame. The stranger, whose chattering, uneven breath slowly steadied as warmth and Edith's careful attention began their work, finally offered a name. Thomas. Those, he said it. Godwin noticed, with the barest hesitation before the word left him, a pause too brief for the children to notice, but not brief enough to escape a farmer whose own livelihood depended on reading subtle signs correctly, whether in soil, or, evidently, in the behavior of an unexpected guest arriving under circumstances that raised more questions than his simple, exhausted request for shelter had answered. What, with the frank curiosity of a 9-year-old entirely unburdened by his father's inside their own homes for 3 full days running. Thomas's answer, when it came, was vague in a way that struck Godwin as deliberate rather than simply the natural confusion of a man still recovering from severe cold exposure. He spoke of traveling south, of business that had been delayed, of misjudging, as travelers across medieval Europe so often tragically did, exactly how quickly the weather could turn against him on open, exposed ground far from any settlement. Edith set a bowl of the evening's pottage before their unexpected guest, a thick, warm mixture of dried peas, barley, and a small portion of the salted bacon the family had carefully rationed to last through what remained of winter, and watched him eat with the particular hunger of a man who had likely gone considerably longer without proper food than his own account of the journey had suggested. Godwin, meanwhile, found himself doing quiet, carefuler arithmetic that any medieval household had facing an unplanned, extended guest would have understood immediately. Their stored food, already carefully rationed to stretch through the season's remaining weeks, now needed to account for one more mouth for however many days this storm continued to make travel, and indeed survival all outside these walls, entirely impossible. It was not resentment that shaped this calculation so much as the same clear-eyed, practical awareness that had shaped every decision Godwin had made since autumn, when he first began the careful work of gathering and storing exactly what his family would need to survive until spring. An awareness that now had to expand without complaint, but not without genuine concern, to include a stranger whose true business on the moor remained, despite his explanation, frustratingly unclear. The storm outside showed no sign of easing as the evening wore toward full night. The wind's assault on the cottage's thin walls grew rowing. If anything, more insistent, and Godwin found his attention returning again and again to the sound, wondering whether the same storm that had nearly claimed Thomas's life might yet find some new way threaten his own family's safety before dawn finally arrived. He rose twice during the evening to check the fire, adding wood with the same careful, measured hand he always used, conscious now more than ever that their supply, adequate for an ordinary storm of 2 or 3 days, would need to stretch further still if this one continued as long as its ferocity suggested it might. Alice, young enough to feel none of her father's growing calculations, had grown steadily more comfortable with their visitor as the evening passed, eventually working up the courage to ask him, with the particular bluntness only a 6-year-old could manage, without any real fear of consequence, why a grown man's eyes kept moving toward the door the way hares did when she was frightened of something in the dark. Thomas's answer to this came slower than any question the adults had asked him. And when it finally came, it was addressed less to Alice herself than to the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames rather than on the child who had asked. He admitted, with what struck Godwin as genuine reluctance rather than any further evasion, that he had reason to believe he was not the only traveler abroad on the moor that night, and that the party he had reason to expect might yet be following was not one whose arrival at this door he could honestly promise would bring the same simple, straightforward need for shelter that had brought him here. The room fell into a silence broken only by the wind and the settling pop-up of the fire, Edith's hand finding Watt's shoulder without any conscious decision to reach for it. And Godwin, watching this stranger's face carefully in the firelight, understood that whatever quiet, uneasy question had been sitting unspoken between them since the moment he first opened that door had just finally been given the shape of a genuine and immediate danger. Godwin asked, with the direct plainness of a man who had already decided that vague reassurance would serve his household considerably less well than the truth, exactly who these other travelers might be, and why a man fleeing them across open moorland, in a storm severe enough to nearly claim his life, would consider that risk preferable to whatever waited behind him. Thomas's account, delivered haltingly, and with the particular care of someone weighing how much a stranger's hospitality genuinely obligated him to disclose, describe a dispute over a debt owed or to a minor lord, some 3 days' journey to the north. A dispute that had, in the telling, escalated well beyond the ordinary, manageable disagreements that medieval manorial courts existed specifically to resolve, into an accusation of theft that Thomas insisted, with evident and genuine feeling, was entirely false, fabricated by a steward eager to seize property that rightfully belonged to Thomas's own family. Medieval manorial justice, Godwin knew well from his own dealings with his lord's court over the years, could indeed be turned toward exactly this kind of abuse when a steward or bailiff held sufficient local power and a tenant lacked the resources or connections to mount an effective defense. Reality that lent Thomas's account a plausibility. Godwin found himself unable to simply dismiss whatever lingering caution the stranger's earlier evasiveness had planted in his mind. Whether pursued by men acting under genuine legal authority, or simply by a steward's hired muscle operating well outside any formal process, Thomas explained that he had chosen the moor route specifically because it offered no formal shelter, no monastery or manor house where pursuers might easily corner him, gambling that the very danger that had nearly killed him might also discourage any but the most determined pursuit. It was a desperate calculation, and one that Godwin recognized immediately as exactly the kind of choice a genuinely frightened man make when every other eruption seemed to lead more certainly toward capture. Though he found himself wondering, with the same careful attention he applied to reading weather and soil, whether desperation alone fully explained the particular route Thomas had chosen, or whether some other piece of this story remained yet unspoken between them. Edith, listening with the same close attention as her husband, found her own mind turning toward a different, more immediately practical concern than the truth or falsehood of Thomas's account. If pursuers genuinely existed and genuinely he intended to follow his trail this far, what obligation and what danger did their arrival at this same door represent for a household that had already, in perfect good conscience and genuine religious obligation, taken in the very man they sought? Medieval law offered no simple, universal answer to this question, since the concept of sanctuary, well established within church buildings themselves, extended only uncertainly and inconsistently into an ordinary tenant farmer's cottage, meaning that Godwin's household now stood, however, unwillingly, at the genuine intersection of religious obligation, practical danger, and a legal situation whose true shape none of them could yet fully see through the storm still raging beyond their walls. The practical matter of the household's remaining firewood, already a quiet concern before Thomas's arrival, now carried an added, sharper urgency since Godwin understood that whatever choice the night had demanded of him, his family's basic survival through the storm's remaining duration could not be allowed to suffer for it. He rose once more to examine the stack against the far wall. Counting with the same careful, practiced eye, he applied to every resource his horse, his household depended upon, and found himself facing a genuine, uncomfortable calculation. Enough remained, by his estimate, to see the family through perhaps 2 more full days and nights at the rate the fire had been burning, a margin that had seemed entirely adequate before an unexpected guest, and possibility of further unexpected guests arriving in pursuit of him had ended in his planning. Medieval households, facing exactly this kind of unplanned strain on carefully managed winter resources, understood the genuine, practical stakes involved with a clarity that required no elaboration among themselves, since the difference between adequate and inadequate fuel during a severe, sustained storm represented, as it did across the medieval countryside more broadly, the difference between discomfort and genuine danger to every person sheltering within these walls. What? Who had been listening to the adult's conversation with far more understanding than his young age might have suggested, asked the question that had clearly been forming in his mind since Thomas first mentioned the possibility of pursuit. What would his father do if men came to this very door, demanding that Thomas be handed over to them? Godwin found he had no immediate, confident answer to offer his son, and rather than manufacture a false certainty he did not feel, he told plainly that the answer would depend considerably on who exactly came to that door, and under what authority they claimed to act. Since a lord's rightfully appointed officer carrying genuine legal authority represented a very different situation and a very different obligation, unarmed men acting purely on a steward's prieth grudge with no genuine legal standing behind their pursuit at all. This distinction, however clear in principle, offered considerably less comfort in practice, since Godwin knew well enough that a frightened household deep in an isolated storm, faced with armed men at their door in the middle of the night, would have very limited practical means of verifying which category of pursuer they actually confronted before any decision about Thomas's fate would need to be made. Thomas, watching this entire exchange with the particular weariness of a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the room, exactly what danger his presence might yet bring down upon a family who had shown him nothing but the genuine, unearned kindness that likely saved his life, offered quietly that he would understand and would not hold against them any decision Godwin ultimately felt he needed to make to protect his own family should pursuers genuinely arrive. It was, Edith thought privately, watching the firelight move across his still pale, still recovering face, either the genuine statement of a fundamentally honest man caught in circumstances beyond his control, or the carefully calculated words of someone who understood precisely how such an offer would work upon a household already inclined by both faith and simple human decency towards sympathy for his situation. And she found herself, despite every effort toward caution, entirely unable to suspended quality that surviving medieval accounts of stormbound households often describe. Ordinary domestic routine continuing alongside an unresolved tension that no one in the room could fully set aside. Edith moved through the familiar tasks of banking the fire for the deepest hours of the night and settling the children towards sleep, though, despite his evident exhaustion, resisted drifting off with the particular stubbornness of a boy determined not to miss whatever might yet happen before morning. Alice succumbed more easily, curled against her mother's side beneath the family's thickest blanket, her earlier curiosity about their guest replaced by the simple, uncomplicated sleep of a child young enough to trust that her parents would manage whatever danger the night still held in store. Godwin, meanwhile, found himself unable to settle at all, moving instead to the shuttered window and pressing his ear against the gap, where wind still forced its way through despite every effort to seal it, listening for any sound beneath the storm zone's own considerable noise that might signal riders or men on foot approaching across the drifted, treacherous ground surrounding the cottage. It was during this long, watchful stretch of the night that Thomas recovered enough by the fire's steady warmth to sit upright without the earlier tremor that had irked her speech, offered Godwin a detail he had not shared before, volunteered now, it seemed, not under any direct questioning, but from some private calculation of his own about what honesty might yet earn him from a household he had come to depend upon so completely. He admitted that the debt dispute underlying his flight involved not simply an accusation of theft, but a specific, disputed inheritance, a modest parcel of land his late father had held, and that the steward now claimed, through documents Thomas insisted had been altered or forged outright, belonged instead to the Moner itself. This was, Godwin recognized immediately, an entirely different and rather more serious matter than a simple debt dispute, since land disputes of exactly this kind, when they escalated beyond a manorial court's ordinary jurisdiction, could draw in considerably more powerful interests than a single local steward, interests that might explain both the apparent seriousness of the pursuit Thomas feared and his own reluctance to disclose the full shape of his situation from the very first moment he crossed this threshold. Edith, listening from where she sat near the sleeping children, found this new detail doing little to resolve her own private, uncivil uncertainty about their guest, since a genuine, serious land dispute could as easily explain a truly innocent man's desperate flight from a corrupt and powerful steward as it could explain a considerably less innocent man's attempt to secure sympathy, shelter, and eventual assistance from a household whose own simple, honest nature made them, she now recognized with some discomfort, rather easy to manipulate should Thomas's story prove less than fully truthful. She said nothing of this private doubt aloud, understanding that voicing it now, in the middle of a night already thick with uncertainty and genuine danger, would serve no purpose beyond adding further strain to a household that needed, above nearly everything else in this moment, and united against whatever the storm and whatever pursuers it might yet deliver to their door, still had in store before dawn finally arrived. The sound Godwin had been dreading finally came somewhere in the deepest, coldest stretch of the night. Not the fist against wood that had announced Thomas's own arrival, but something quieter, and in its way, considerably more unsettling, the low, unmistakable sound of horses, more than one by the muffled rhythm of hooves struggling through deep snow, moving somewhere near enough to the cottage that the wind alone could not explain what he was hearing. He straightened from his position by the window with a speed, though that woke Will instantly, and drew Idiot's sharp, immediate attention away from the sleeping Alice. And across the small room, Thomas's face, still pale from his earlier ordeal, went paler still, his whole body going rigid with the particular stillness of a man who had spent the last several days genuinely fearing exactly this moment might arrive. Godwin moved quickly, but without panic, drawing on the same clear, practical thinking that had shaped every decision of this long night, and gestured Thomas toward the lean-to, where the family's cow was sheltered, a space that offered, if not true concealment, at least enough separation from the cottage's single main room that a search conducted without genuine thoroughness might overlook it entirely. It was not, Godwin knew, even as he made the suggestion, any guarantee of safety, but it represented the only practical option available to a household with neither the time nor the physical means to construct anything more elaborate. And Thomas, understanding this as clearly as Godwin did, moved toward the narrow, connecting doorway without protest, pausing only long enough to meet Godwin's eyes with an expression that carried, in the brief, firelit moment before he ducked through into the animal shelter's deeper darkness, something that looked, to Godwin's own uncertain judgment, genuinely like fear rather than any calculation, though he still could not have said with full confidence which of those two possibilities he was actually witnessing. The knock came moments later, considerably harder than Thomas's own exhausted effort had managed hours before, accompanied by a voice, gruff and carrying clear authority, demanding entry in the name of the manor's lord, a claim that Godwin, drawing on years of dealing with his own lord's officers over disputes and dues, recognized immediately as the kind of formal, legally grounded demand that a household in his position had genuinely limited practical ability to refuse outright. Aware with a clarity that felt almost physical of everything now resting on the next several minutes, of his family's safety, of whatever genuine or false claim of authority, did not fully know. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe and leave a comment. Have a good night.